Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Today we finish up our all-important discussion on intervals, and then it's on to the fascinating world of scales and modes. Over the next few hours, we're going to see how all these elements, intervals, scales, and chords, begin to meld together to explain why songs are structured the way they are. Make sure you've got your intervals down. Remember, scales and chords are all made up of intervals. All set? Here we go. Hi, how you doing? Welcome back. We just got a couple more things to talk about scales. I'm not going to do a review of what we talked about last time, so make sure you're looking back at that. Intervals may be the most important word in all of music theory. Remember, ear training is the most important word in all of music, but specifically in the subject of music theory, intervals might be the most important word. That's because everything you're going to find out, including the scales that we look at today, are all made up of intervals. Remember, intervals are the distance between the notes. Like any pitch patterns, we actually said that there were 6 things you have to do to claim that you've mastered any one of these levels. You have to know the official term, you have to know what the definition of it is, you have to be able to give examples and formulas of the different phenomenon, you need to be able to play it, obviously, you need to know the finger patterns, and that's what we did in this column right here. Ultimately, you need to ear train this stuff so that you know what all these intervals sound like. And finally, you'd like to be able to look and recognize what it looks like when you see it on paper, too, in notational form. So we've done most of that already, and we even talked about the different categories of intervals over here: simple versus compound, melodic versus harmonic, major versus minor, what perfect, augmented, and diminished all mean. We have one more subject to talk about, and this next one down here, which is this whole big chart area down here, which is the whole subject of what are called inverted intervals. And every interval has what might be known as its mirror image. Like you're looking at it in a mirror. And another way to think of it, it's kind of like every interval can be taken and turned like inside out. And that's what inverted intervals are all about. Now, the way they generally show you what inverted intervals are all about, if we could look at this little set of numbers right here, is you write the numbers 1 through 8, and then you write them again backwards underneath that. So 8 and 1. You'll notice each time that they add up to 9, by the way. 6 and 3, 7 and 2, 8 and 1. And you learn to associate these numbers. For example, you learn to associate 7 and 2. And you learn to associate 6 and 3 and 4 and 5. And these are the inversions. For example, an inverted 7th is a 2nd. An inverted 6th is a 3rd. And an inverted 5th is a 4th. Now, in a moment, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes, like why it's significant that you have to know this stuff. But you just kind of got to learn this by rote a little bit in the beginning. So let's take our first example here, where a inverted seventh is actually a second. We're associating the numbers 7 and 2. Well, remember this: there are two types of sevenths and two types of seconds. There's major and minor sevenths, and there's major and minor seconds. So, how do you tell? Okay, so you've got to invert a seventh, but the question is it a major seventh or a minor seventh? Let's say that it's a major seventh, and we want to find out what an inverted major seventh is. Well, it's going to be a second of some sort, and we know that. But remember, there's a major second and a minor second, too. And what you want to remember to do is you want to do what I call a major minor or an augmented and diminished flip-flop. That's why I have the words flip-flop right there. Because, for example, an inverted major seventh is a minor second. You see that the majorness and minorness gets flip-flopped. Can you tell me this? Here's a question for you. What is an inverted minor sixth? Can you tell? Might want to think about it for a second. What's an inverted minor sixth? It's a major third. Because remember, we associate the numbers 6 and 3, and we flip-flop the majorness and minorness. What is an inverted augmented fourth? It's a diminished fifth. Let's write a few of those examples down so you can kind of look at them. An inverted major 7 is a minor second. An inverted minor sixth is a major third. An inverted, one last interval of that sort is an inverted augmented fourth is a diminished fifth. Because, again, we're associating the numbers 4 and 5. And so you can basically just learn how to invert your intervals kind of by rote like that. And in a moment, you'll see why that stuff all becomes significant. Now, another thing, remember, another whole category of intervals that we have are perfect intervals. And the thing to remember is when you invert perfect intervals stay perfect. Perfect stays perfect. So an inverted perfect fourth is a perfect fifth. Another interesting thing to realize is then, back here to where we see 8 and 1, we learn to associate those two numbers as well. And those are the octave, of course, and the unison. So interestingly enough, an inverted perfect octave is a perfect unison. Remember, a unison is an interval of 0, and an octave is an interval of an octave. That's significant because here's another interesting fact about intervals that you want to keep in the back of your mind. An interval added to its inverted self always equals 1 octave. So let's write that fact down. An interval plus its inversion, if you add the two together, always equals 1 octave. Let's look at our first example here. A major seventh, an inverted major seventh, is a minor second. How large an interval is a major seventh? Well, you might remember that it's 11 half steps. It is, after all, the next interval smaller than an octave. So that's 11 half steps. A minor second, you might recall, is another name for a half step. So that's, if a major seventh is 11 half steps and a minor second is 1 half step, that's 12 half steps. That equals an octave. A minor sixth is 8 half steps, and a major third is 4 half steps. 8 and 4 is 12. That's 1 octave right there. Another way of looking at it, actually, is if you take an octave If you take those 12 half steps in an octave and you subtract a given interval, say a major third, whatever is left of that interval is its inversion. And that's what this chart down here kind of shows. Notice you've got, right across here, you've got your musical number system. So there's our chromatic octave right there. And if you follow these red lines right through the box, you'll see that, for example, here's our smallest interval right here, which is a half step, or in other words, a minor second. If you invert a minor second, in other words, if you follow that line up through the box, a minor second is a major seventh. You know, there's that, and then if I subtract a half step from an octave, what's left? This whole big interval from here all the way back to the end of the octave, so that's a major seventh. Likewise, this next interval here is a major second. So if we follow that red line up to here, we find out that that's a minor seventh. The next interval is a minor third. That turns out to be a major sixth. A major third, if we follow the red line up here, turns out to be a minor sixth. Next interval is a perfect fourth. And remember, perfect intervals stay perfect. Oh, I'm sorry, a perfect fourth. Did I say fifth? Oh, I did say fourth. Okay. A perfect fourth inverted is actually a perfect fifth. And an augmented fourth is a diminished fifth. So if you follow the red lines on the chart, now remember you have a copy of this chart in your booklet on page 14, and so you can look at this and you can perhaps see it better than you can actually see it on the monitor here. But an interval added to its inverted self always equals 1 octave, or if you take an octave and subtract an interval like a major third from it, whatever is left over after you do that subtraction is what the inversion of that interval is. Now, you just want to kind of learn this stuff by rote. In a sense, it's going to be a little while before this makes a whole lot of sense to you. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example in a moment, but you might be asking yourself, what's this about? Why do I have to know this stuff? And the answer is, and this is quite significant, particularly when we get down into the further lessons where we're talking about chords and stuff like that. An interval will often function like its inversion. An interval will often function in the music like its own inverted self. A minor sixth will very often function harmonically the same way as a major third. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of that. If we can look up here at the keyboard for a second. Key of C, we give so many of our examples. And we also, remember, I know you're here to take guitar lessons, but in so many ways it's easier. You already know how to finger all your inversions on the guitar, or hopefully you're working towards that. So many times it's just easier to see theory on a keyboard. I try to encourage all my students to memorize a piano keyboard. It's much easier to do theory calculations on. Now, look at these two notes right here. Actually, I'll go down an octave right to there. If you notice, those are 4 half steps apart. 1, 2, 3, 4. What interval is that? That's a major third. Now, the two notes I'm playing are C and E. Well, what if I did this? What if I took the E and left it right where it is? But what if I took the C and booted it up to the next octave, to this C up here? Here's a major third. I booted the C up to here, kept the E in the same place, but I played this higher C. How far apart in pitch are these two notes? Well, they are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 half steps apart. That's a minor sixth. So what we can see is if I turn a major third inside out, I get a minor sixth. And remember, a minor sixth is 8 half steps and a major third is 4 half steps, so that equals 12. Now, I'll kind of show you just quickly on the guitar here for a moment a song that many of you know in which you can kind of clearly hear thirds and sixths functioning as inversions of each other. It's an old Van Morrison song you might know called Brown Eyed Girl. And you know there's that guitar riff at the middle of at the beginning of the song, and you know it repeats a couple of other places in the song, but it goes like this. Now, I don't know that you'll be able to see this clearly enough, but these intervals that I'm playing in the beginning, I'm playing on 2 consecutive strings, my G string and my B string. Right now I'm just playing them open. And then I'm altering the pitches on those 2 strings. What you'll just have to kind of take my word about is that the intervals in between, I'm playing 2 notes at the same time, aren't I? That's a little bit of harmony. There's an interval between those 2 notes. What is it? Well, in this case, they are all thirds because they're on consecutive strings. If you can see which you probably can't, the fingering well enough, you'll know that these are intervals of a third. Sometimes they're major thirds and sometimes they're minor thirds. Now, a little further up the neck, listen to this. You all recognize that riff. I'm going to play this same riff now using inverted thirds, which of course are 6. So that would be up here. Now here, you'll notice I'm playing a string, I'm skipping a string, and then playing the note on the next string over there. So there's a string in between that I'm not playing. So that must be a larger interval, right? If I'm skipping over a string to get to my higher note and going to a string that's 2 strings over, that must be a larger interval than if I was playing notes on 2 consecutive strings, right? So again, you'll just sort of have to trust me on this unless you can really look at this quickly enough and see what's going on. I'm actually playing sixths here. And now listen to this. Oops. Now listen to how I originally played it down here at the bottom of the neck again. Oops. Now here it is with sixths again. Now, do you hear that, in a sense, those obviously didn't sound exactly the same, did they? But they sounded pretty close to being the same. So, in the second example, when I was skipping that string there and playing sixths, I want to suggest that that was the same riff. It was just built out of sixths instead of thirds. In other words, those sixths that I was playing were actually functioning as inverted thirds. So that's why you need to understand your inverted intervals, because an interval will often function like its inversion. And when we particularly get towards the end of the program and we're looking seriously at chord structure and specifically the subject of chord voicing, you'll find that there are lots of examples of where chords are voiced using inverted intervals. Okay. Well, that really wraps up the subject of intervals, and it's on now to level number 4 of my 6 levels of theory. That's a huge thing we've just finished there. Remember, intervals might be the most important word in all of music theory. And you know, as I've said before, you can easily be forgiven for kind of like going, well, what the heck has this got to do with anything? But it's coming. I promise you that. And then over the next couple of hours, you're going to see where all this is going to. It's a very exciting place you're at right now. Remember, what we're actually doing here is that we're working our way through what I call the 6 levels of pitch theory. In the beginning of part 1, we learned all about the basic things about music and about pitch. Now we're actually getting in there and quite specifically learning these 50 different pitch patterns that we keep talking about. And we're learning them in order of complexity in 6 different increments. The first one, remember, the simplest patterns of pitch was silence. Where would music be without silence? The next most complex patterns are one note. So from no notes to one note, and then the next most complex patterns involve 2 notes and the relationship between them. That's the whole huge subject of intervals that we just learned about. Now it's on to level number 4 of our 6 levels of theory, and this is where we begin to look at the more complex pitch patterns, and we're going to think of these as like more complex patterns that are all made up of intervals. That's why we had to talk about intervals first. Now we're going to strum a bunch of smaller intervals together, and we're entering the fascinating world of scales. And a lot of you know some things about scales already. Scales and modes. A lot of you have heard of modes, but I bet you're terribly confused about what modes are and why they're significant to know. They're hugely important to know, but a lot of times it's another subject they don't explain very well, but I think I'll probably be able to get you to understand it. Scales and modes. And we're also going to get into the related subject. This is going to be our first look at chord progressions, like why do we keep seeing the same combinations of chords over and over again in songs. So we're also going to be talking about what's known as triads in a key. Our first basic look at what's known as harmonization as we go here. Now, scales and modes. Level number 4 of my 6 levels of pitch theory. We have the same 6 things to do with this level that we did with intervals. Name it, define it, give examples and formulas, be able to read it, be able to hear it, and finally know how to play it on your instrument right there. So we've named it. It's called scales, and later on we'll be talking about what modes are all about. Let's define it. Remember, when we were talking about the musical number system, we said that most people think that a scale is a sequence of notes. And that's true. But the only thing is, that's only half the definition. If you're not using the word intervals as part of your definition of what a scale is, you're not getting the whole picture. Yes, a scale is a sequence of notes, but those notes are separated by specific intervals. Now, we just went through looking at all of our 13 different intervals that we have to know, but the only intervals that you really need to understand about in this discussion are, first of all, if we could look up at the keyboard here for a second, the first interval you want to make sure you understand is this rather large interval that we call an octave. Now, people go, wait a minute, an interval's like 13 notes, isn't it? And I go, well, you can think of it that way, too, but another important way to think of it is it's the distance between 2 notes. That's a large interval. The only other intervals we need to concern ourselves with today are very small intervals. For example, the distance from one note to the note right next to it. Remember what that interval's called? You might remember that that's called a half step, right? Let's use its official name, though, relative to the musical number system. Do you remember what that is? What's the number name for a half step? It's a minor second. Remember that? A minor second is actually a half step. The next interval we need to concern ourselves with is where we skip a note and go to the next note after that. That's a whole step, or in other words, a major second. So mainly the 2 intervals we have to know about to understand scales are half steps and whole steps, or in other words, minor and major seconds. But on a few of these scales, we're also going to see the interval where we play a note, skip 2 notes, and then play the next note after that. So these notes are actually 3 half steps apart. You might be thinking of that interval as a minor third, but you'll also notice that that same interval can be called an augmented second. So actually, one generalization that we can make about, at least about the scales that we're going to be talking about, are the intervals that are involved in creating scales are all seconds. And so that's the main intervals that you have to know for today. You have to know your minor seconds, your major seconds, and your augmented seconds. So a scale is a sequence of notes separated by specific intervals, and these are generally major, minor, and augmented seconds. That's the most important interval that you have to think about when you're learning about scales, is seconds. So, we've named it. It's called scales. We've defined it. It's a sequence of notes separated by specific intervals. Now, on to what I call examples and formulas. Now, we had 13 different intervals we had to learn something about. How many scales are we going to have to learn about? Well, interestingly enough, as we go through the rest of this program, you're going to find out, much to your surprise, that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of scales, which strikes a lot of people as being odd, because many times a lot of you, the only scales you maybe have ever going to have even heard of, two you heard of from me so far: a chromatic scale, which, remember, is when you play all 12 notes in a sequence, and that thing called a major diatonic scale, which goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And that's where the musical number system came from. But those are only two of dozens of different types of scales. Another type of scale that you might have heard of already, for example, a lot of you that have maybe been involved with jamming with your friends and reading some books and stuff, you've all heard of pentatonic scales. And you might have all heard that pentatonic scales are very important scales in understanding popular music and understanding rock music. And that's true. And we're going to be listing pentatonic scales down here too. But in addition, there are all these other scales that you haven't ever heard of. And people go, why do I have to learn these if I haven't heard of them? Well, the funny thing is, it's another example of how badly this stuff is taught a lot of the times. Interestingly enough, even though you've never even heard of these scales before, you've already been playing them. Remember, the promise I make everyone is I'm not stuffing your head with a bunch of dumb junk you don't need to know. This is all about pop, rock music, country music, whatever you like to play. All of these scales on this page, and there's 14 of them. Remember, I said there's dozens and dozens and dozens of different scales, but I'm not going to show you those right now. We will talk a little bit about them later, but this is what I call my must-know list. There are 14 scales on this list, and we need now to look at what their patterns of intervals actually are. Remember, they're all sequences of seconds: half steps, whole steps, and step-and-a-half intervals. Now, we're going to list them in this column over here, and then using my little box system, which you've seen several times before, we're going to look at their actual pattern of intervals. And of course, the very first interval, at least the way I teach, the very first scale, at least the way I teach music, that you'd want to know about is that first one that you and I talked about. It's the chromatic scale. And what do we know about a chromatic scale? We know that it's when you play all 13 notes in an octave, and each of those notes is separated from the next one by an interval of a minor second, a half step. So in my little box system of expressing systems of intervals, what that would mean is then that we're going to have 13 little boxes all butted up right against each other, because all of the 13 notes in a chromatic scale are all a half step apart from one another. As significant as it is to know that a chromatic scale is a sequence of 13 notes, it's almost more significant to understand that a chromatic scale is a sequence of 12 half steps. When the boxes are butted right up against each other, that means they're a half step apart. If there's a space in between them, that's a skipped note, and that means it's a whole step apart. So our first scale that we'd want to know about is a chromatic scale. Now, the very next scale that we would want to know about is also one that you and I have talked about so far. It's that thing that we learned back in the musical number system, the do-re-mi scale. It's that thing called a major diatonic scale. And you already know what the pattern of intervals for that is. Hopefully you remember that. We'll be writing it down for a second. But we're going to introduce another concept now, too. There is an alternate naming system that involves the subject of modes that we need to begin to explore. These scales often have more than one name, and a lot of this has to do with these modes. And the major diatonic scale has another name that we want to begin to associate with it. It's also known as the Ionian mode. The Ionian mode is the major diatonic scale. Two names for the same pattern of intervals. Next week when we talk about modes, you'll see why that's significant. Now, as we know, if we're going to write out our pattern of intervals for a major scale, we know it goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or in other words, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. So if we were to look at that as a series of little boxes, it would look like this. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, half step to 4. 3 and 4 are right next to each other. They're a half step apart. Whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. And we also know this is where we get our musical number system from too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Half steps or minor seconds between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Now, these are the two scales that we have talked about so far. We have 12 more scales to talk about today. The next scale that we're going to look at, interestingly enough, you're about to learn a very interesting thing. This thing that we've been calling the major scale so far is not the only major scale. It's the only one that's called the major diatonic scale, but there are more than one major scales. And this is a time for us to actually talk about something. I think I've mentioned this before. I hope I have. What is the difference between majorness and minorness? Now, we talked about what major and minor intervals are about. We said that if you go up a major interval from note number 1, you land on a note that's in a major scale. If you go up a minor interval from note number 1, you land on a note that's not in a major scale, like flat 2 or flat 3 or something like that. But the meanings of the words major and minor, they have a slightly different meaning when you're talking about more complex patterns like scales and chords. When you're talking about the difference between major and minor in scales and chords, it all has to do with one particular note. And that's this note right here, note number 3. Patterns that are considered major patterns contain note number 3. Well, I'm oversimplifying just a little bit right now, but for a scale or a chord to be a major chord, it has to have note number 3 in it. So we'll kind of color that in a little bit to set it apart. Interestingly enough, it also has to have a 5 in it as well. For example, there is a pattern that has a 3 in it, but since it doesn't have a 5 in it, it's not considered major. So you kind of want to notice this. Inside of this major diatonic scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, is this sub-pattern, 1, 3, 5. 1, 3, 5. That, interestingly enough, if I haven't mentioned this enough yet, that is actually the spelling of a major chord, a major triad. When we're talking a little more about scale structure, you're going to find out that major chord is 1, 3, 5. It's right there on your slide rule. On the chord side, the upper left-hand corner up there is a major chord. 1, 3, 5. Now, the difference between a major scale or a major chord and a minor scale or a minor chord is minor patterns do not contain note number 3. They have a 1 and a 5 in them, but they don't contain note number 3. They contain the note that's 1/2 step lower than that, which is a flatted third. Right? You could call it a sharp 2, but in this context, it's mostly referred to as a flatted third. So major patterns contain note number 3. Minor patterns contain the flatted third. And in this area down here, we're going to list all of our minor scales. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, our first big surprise is that there's more than one major scale. You could probably speculate that there might be a bunch of different interval patterns that contain 1, 3, and 5, which qualifies them as major, but maybe the half steps aren't quite where they are. And our first example of that is a hugely common and important scale, believe it or not. Even though you've never heard of this before, you've hardly ever played a song that doesn't have this scale in it, and it's called the Lydian mode. These are names that were kind of codified for us by the classic Greek civilization. And so these are Greek words, ancient Greek words. A Lydian mode is a major scale. That means it has 1, 3, and 5. But how is it going to differ from the major diatonic scale? The intervals are going to be shuffled around a little. A Lydian scale, or a Lydian mode, starts off pretty much the same way as Ionian, or the major diatonic scale. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3. So 1, 2, 3. So far, it's just like a major diatonic scale, but here's where it's different. You don't have a half step after note number 3. You have another whole step, which brings you up to this note right here. Now, my question is this. What number note is that right there? Well, it's halfway in between 4 and 5. So in this particular case, we're going to refer to it as a sharp 4. See how that would be true? It's not a 4, it's not a 5, it's halfway in between. It's a sharp 4. You could call it a flat 5, but in this case we call it sharp 4. Now, the rest of Lydian mode is identical to the Ionian mode. Here we have a half step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. So, Lydian mode, it has a 1, a 3, and a 5 in it, so it qualifies as a major scale. But since it doesn't have half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, it's simply a different kind of major scale. You have hardly ever played a song that doesn't have that scale in it, believe it or not. Isn't that interesting? And we're going to be showing you when we talk about modes what I mean by that. But all the scales on the must-know list are very important to know about. We're also going to listen to all these scales. That may have to wait till next time. But we're going to find out what all these different scales sound like, too. The next scale that we're going to look at is also a major scale. That means it has a 1, a 3, and a 5 in it also, but the intervals are shuffled around a little bit again. This is even more of an important scale. This is called Mixolydian. Mixolydian is also a major scale. It starts off identical to the Ionian mode. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, half step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6. But here's where it's different. Mixolydian mode, after note number 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Our next interval after that is a half step. Instead of the whole step that took us from 6 to 7, we only go up a half step in the Mixolydian mode after note number 6. That, in this context, is known as a flat 7. It's a half step above 6. And then we finally have our last whole step up to 8. Our octave note up there. Notice once again that it has a 1, it has a 3, and it has a 5 in it, which qualifies it as a major scale. It's just that that interval, that half-step interval, is different than it was in the original major scale up there. As I said, we're going to listen to all these scales and find out what they sound like. Some of them you're going to go, oh yeah, I've heard that before, and just nobody ever told you about it before. Okay, there are other major scales as well. Over the course of the program here, we're going to talk about another 4 or 5. In fact, today, when we get down here, we're going to talk about major pentatonic scales too, but they're generally given their own kind of special category. The next scales that we're going to look at, these were all major scales, these 3. You see this little faint red line separating those 3 scales right there as being major scales, Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. Now we are about to look at minor scales. You probably have maybe speculated by this time if there are major scales, there's probably got to be minor scales. That's true. What separates a major scale from a minor scale? As we mentioned a few minutes ago, major scales have note number 3, and all of them did. Minor scales don't have that note. They have the note in this space right here, which is a flatted third, a minor third, right in there. The first minor scale we are going to look at is called melodic minor. Now, you're also, some of you are going to, I'm just going to quickly mention when we get here, there's a couple of different ways of looking at the concept of the melodic minor scale. I'm going to write it down one particular way. A melodic minor scale, the way we think of it today, is it is essentially like the major diatonic scale, except for that one difference. It has a flatted third instead of a third. So that scale would go 1, whole step to 2, and then a half step right away up to flat 3. 1, 2, flat 3. That makes the pattern sound sad. That's what we always know. The other difference between major and minor is major stuff with its thirds sounds happy. Minor stuff with its flatted thirds sounds sad. Now, the rest of the scale is identical to our original major diatonic scale. Whole step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, and finally our last half step up to 8. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we know it's a minor scale because it has 1, it has flat 3, and it has 5 in it. So that's a minor scale. Now, some of you who have taken some music theory courses know that this is kind of a strange scale. The way they used to teach it, it was said that the melodic minor scale was slightly different depending on whether you were going up the scale or whether you were coming down. And I'm just going to talk about that briefly. We don't tend to think that way so much in modern music anymore. But it is said that this is melodic minor when you're going up the scale. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But if you're playing a melodic pattern that then begins to come back down the scale, you don't play 7 and 6 anymore. You actually, in the descending aspect of melodic minor, when you're coming back down the scale, you're actually supposed to play a flat 7 and a flat 6. Those of you who've had some music theory probably remember that. And interestingly enough, I'll play this one right now. This is left over from the 19th century classical music. Excuse me. And they just felt that melodies were more, why it's called melodic minor, but they just felt that melodies were more successful if you had a different minor scale pattern going up than you did down. So going up the scale, it sounded like this. There's that sad-sounding minor chord that's embedded right inside that. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But when you came back down the scale, you didn't play the 7 and the 6. You played the flat 7 and the flat 6. So going up and down, it was supposed to sound like this. Now, the descending aspect of melodic minor is the same with the flat 6 and the flat 7, is the same as one of these other minor scales, this one right here that we're going to list as we get further down the page. Modern players tend to think of the melodic minor scale as just being that pattern right there. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then this scale with the flat 6 and the flat 7, they think of being what's called the natural minor or the Aeolian mode. And we'll be getting to that one in a moment. So that's your melodic minor scale. The rest of these are pretty easy. The next minor scale that we're going to learn, now you'll notice that I have room here for 5 different minor scales. Again, a lot of you are going to have heard in music theory classes that there are only 3 minor scales. And that's just not the right way to look at music, I don't feel. There are actually, remember, a scale to be minor has to have a 1, a flat 3, and a 5 in it, and there are several different patterns which are minor scales. You'll see kind of why they tell you that there's only 3, but I'm going to tell you actually today about 6 of them, and then there are actually several other ones that we'll wind up talking about briefly as we go through the rest of the program. The next scale, and one that you might not have been told about before, is another one of the Greek-named scales. It's called Dorian. Now, Dorian is pretty easy. It just goes 1, whole step to 2, half step to flat 3. That's how we know it's minor. Whole step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6. So far it's been identical to the melodic minor. Here's where it's different. After note number 6, you have your next half step. 1, 2, 3, oops, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. That's how it's different. It's a minor scale with a flat 7 in it. And then finally, whole step to 8. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8 is what's known as the Dorian mode. And once again, it has a, whoops, what did I do with my pencil? It has a 1 and a flat 3. and a 5 in it. So once again, that's what tells us that it's a minor scale. The next scale that we're going to look at is a little less common than some of the other minor scales we've listed, but still very important scale to know in popular music. Weird name. It's called Phrygian. 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 Anyway, you'll see it's written correctly on your on the sheet in front of you there. Phrygian mode. Now, this is a rather odd scale. This is the first scale and only one of 2 on our must-know list where the first interval, the first 2 notes in the scale are actually separated by a half step. So, 1 half step to flat 2. We haven't seen any scales yet in our entire list here that has a flatted second in it at all. This is the first one that where its first interval is a half step. 1 flat 2. However, then there's a whole step to flat 3. So it's beginning to look like it's minor. 4, 5. So it's got a 1, a flat 3, and a 5 in it. 1 flat 3 5. So that's how we know it's minor. Here's some of its differences right at the end. After 5, we have a half step this time to flat 6, whole step to flat 7, and finally a whole step to 8. So this one is the one that has the greatest number of notes that are not in a major scale. Flatted 2nd, flatted 3rd, flatted 6th, flatted 7th. There are a couple of other scales that we're going to see that have even more altered notes than that. But so far, that's been the one that is least like the major scale. The next minor scale we're going to look at is, I want to say, probably the central and most important and most common minor scale in Western music. It, like the Ionian mode, it has a couple of different names. We call it the Ionian mode or the major diatonic scale. This scale down here is kind of its darker cousin. It's like the light side of the force and the dark side of the force. And so it has several different names too. Sometimes it is referred to as the natural minor. It's called the natural minor. It's also, you're going to hear it related to the concept of what's called minor diatonic. Major diatonic was our first scale that we learned there, and now this is minor diatonic. It's also tied up in the concept of what's known as relative minor, which we'll be talking about when we get to the subject of modes. You don't have to worry that you don't understand any of these terms right now. All of this will be covered as we go through the rest of the program. This scale also was one of the ones that was named by the Greeks too, so it has a modal name as well. It's known as the Aeolian mode. Many of these scales so far have had that alternative name, alternative Greek name. Aeolian or natural minor goes 1, whole step to 2, half step to flat 3. That's how we know it's minor. Whole step to 4, whole step to 5. Here's where it's different. Just like Phrygian mode, it has a half step from 5 to flat 6. Then a whole step to flat 7, and then a whole step to 8. And people are going, I've never heard of any of this stuff. Is this guy nuts telling me that I have to know this stuff? This is the weird world of modes, which we're going to be talking about next time. And the fascinating thing is, if you've ever done any kind of jamming at all with friends of yours, maybe you've gone over to someone's house on a Saturday afternoon and kind of jammed around with them, you were already playing these scales. You just didn't know that you were. And that's very powerful information to have. We'll be talking about that next time. The natural minor, the Aeolian mode, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Very important scale. Once again, it's got a 1 and a flat 3 and a 5 in it. So no matter what else is going on in it, we know that it's a minor scale. Last minor scale that we're going to be talking about for now, the 5th one, is called harmonic minor. Now, harmonic minor starts off being identical to the natural minor. In other words, it goes 1, whole step to 2, half step to flat 3, whole step to 4, whole step to 5, half step to flat 6. Oops, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6. But here's where it's different. Remember, we said scales are made up of seconds. Major seconds, which are half steps. Minor seconds, I got that backwards. Minor seconds, which are half steps. Major seconds, which are whole steps. And then augmented seconds, which are 3 half steps or a step and a half interval. This is our first scale that has one of those larger intervals in it. After we get to flat 6, we don't skip just one note. We actually skip 2 notes before we go up to note number 7, and then a half step to 8. This is a step and a half interval right here between flat 6 and 7, 1.5 steps. And nonetheless, this scale still has a 1 and a flat 3 and a 5 in it, so it's still a minor scale. Now, one thing I'll mention right now, what we're going to be doing next week is we're going to be looking at how to finger these scales. We're probably not going to have time to do that today, but in the next lesson I'm going to show you all the multiple different ways there are to finger all these scales. But I want to suggest one thing right now, even there while you're sitting there at home, you'll be able to, one way that you could play any one of these scales, if you think about it a little, is take your major scale finger patterns, which we gave you back when we were talking about the musical number system. Take your major scale finger patterns and just modify it. For example, let's take Dorian here. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Well, if you think about it, Dorian mode is just like a major scale, except you substitute a flat 3 for the 3, and you substitute a flat 7 for a 7. Now, you should know your fretboard well enough now that you know where the notes in a major scale are, so you know where note number 3 is. Flat 3 will simply be 1 fret below that, 1 half step in pitch lower than where the major third is, and flat 7 will be just 1 half step lower than the major 7th. And I'll play you this example right now. You probably know how to play a major scale. One of the easiest ones was to start with Do under your second finger on your low E string, and then you might remember it was 1, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, or in other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 8. There's your octave right there, the interval of an octave that we talked about last time. Now, if you want to play Dorian mode, all you have to do is take your 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Can we see note number 3 here? 1, 3. Remember, that was a major third. 1, 2, 3. If this is 1, 3, if that's 3, where's flat 3? It's right there. It's 1 half step, 1 fret lower. So if I'm playing a major scale, in order to play Dorian, all I have to do is go 1, 2, flat 3, and then a whole step to 4, 5, 6. Oops, 6. And then usually for a major scale, we went up to note 7, 6, 7, and then a half step to 8. But here we're going to go 6, half step to flat 7, 6, flat 7, 8. So here's major scale again. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Here's Dorian mode. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8. Da, 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 da. So if you use that kind of thinking, you can see that if you just think about it a little, you could even for now write out your own chart. You could modify your major scale finger pattern to play any one of these scales, but next time I'm going to be showing you how to play all of these scales, so you don't necessarily have to do that right now either. The next scales we need to fill in here quickly are scales that you have probably heard of before. These are the pentatonic scales. Pentatonic. Now, what does pentatonic mean? Pentatonic means 5 notes. Not, you know, the word tonic means root note, but it doesn't actually in this case. It just means tone or note. A pentatonic scale is a 5-note scale. Now, all of the other scales we've seen up here have been 7-note scales. Actually, 8-note scales if you include the octave note. And that's a point I want to make. you're really better off thinking of a pentatonic scale as having 6 notes in it instead of 5, because you are actually, if you think that a pentatonic scale only has 5 notes, you're not including the octave note. So even though it's called pentatonic, don't forget your octave note. Pentatonic scale. And that also means there's going to be some larger intervals in this scale too, because if there's fewer notes to cover the full octave, then that must mean they must be spread further apart. A pentatonic scale goes 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3. And now here's where it gets interesting. It's another one of those step-and-a-half intervals, because then we skip 4 and sharp 4 and jump all the way up to 5. So that's a step-and-a-half interval right there. Whole step to 6. And then, interestingly enough, we have another step-and-a-half interval to get us back up to 8. A pentatonic scale goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. And it's got 2 step-and-a-half intervals in it, because if you have fewer notes, they must be spread further apart. Notice also that there are no half steps in a pentatonic scale. It's still a major scale. It's still got a 1, a 3, and a 5. In fact, the actual official name of this scale is this is a major pentatonic scale. I should have listed that back here. This is a scale called a major pentatonic scale. There is also a scale called a minor pentatonic scale. Now, many of you know about this scale. This is very important in blues playing and in hard rock types of styles of playing. And we'll be talking all about that stuff in the next couple hours. Minor pentatonic, 6 notes per octave. Note number 1, and then right away we bump into this step-and-a-half business, because we skip flat 2 and 2 and jump all the way up to flat 3. That's a step-and-a-half interval. 3 half steps. So that's flat 3. Whole step to 4. Whole step to 5. Then we have another step-and-a-half interval, which leads us up to flat 7, which is a very important note in blues and hard rock playing. And then 8. Minor pentatonic. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. And once again, 2 step-and-a-half intervals in that scale. We still have 3 more scales to go on the must-know list that we've just got to dash through. These next 2 here are not anywhere near as common in popular music, but they represent such special moments in music that even though they don't come up too often, when they do, you've got to know something about them. These are what are known as symmetrical scales. That is, their interval pattern has a very profound regularity to how the intervals fall. We've already seen one absolutely symmetrical scale up at the very top up here, which is the chromatic scale. The symmetry of a chromatic scale is that it's all half steps all the way through the whole scale. There is also a scale called a whole tone scale, which is all whole steps. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, whole step to sharp 4, whole step to sharp 5, whole step to flat 7 or sharp 6, whole step to 8. This scale is all made up of whole steps. 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, sharp 5, sharp 6, 8. There is also another scale whose pattern of intervals just keeps flip-flopping back and forth. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. This is what's known as a diminished scale. It goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, double flat 7. How do you like that? We'll be talking about that. It's actually note number 6, but in this context, it's better to think of it as a double flat. There are double sharps and there are double flats, and then this would be 7 and 8. That's a diminished scale. We'll be listening to all these next week. These have very interesting spins to them. One last scale here quickly is our last Greek-named scale, known as the Locrian mode. It's the 7th diatonic mode. It's the other scale that starts off with a half step, 1, flat 2, whole step to flat 3, whole step to 4, half step to flat 5, whole step to flat 6, whole step to flat 7, whole step to 8. Awful lot of different notes in here. 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Once again, not as common as some of the other scales on the page, but you should definitely know these 14 scales anyway. And there you go. That's the end of the list for now. Now, next time what we're going to be doing is we're going to first of all, we're going to listen to all of these different scales and find out what they sound like and compare how they sound. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to learn how to finger a big majority of these scales. We may not look at every last fingering of every scale for now. You will notice that you have in your booklet of support material, you have finger charts for all of these different scales. You can begin to look at that now if you want to, but it may require that I explain a little bit more before you'll actually see how that works. But anyway, for now, that's all the time we actually have. Remember, keep reviewing all your old material. Look back at your old, particularly the subject of intervals. Notice how important it is to understand intervals in order to understand how scales work. But until then, I'm Scotty West, and keep on practicing and keep on thinking about music. Remember, you got to know what you're doing, and we're on to some really exciting stuff next time. We'll see you then. Have a good time, okay?